Hello everybody and welcome to this. It's the first in a brand new series on Michael Frayn's Spies. This video series is a little bit different to the others because I'm not going to make a huge series of videos. I just am making a couple of videos and pointing you to the brand new educational edition of Spies from Faber and Faber. Now what do you get? You get the complete novel and then about 80 pages of detailed analysis of language, structure, form, theme, sample question and answer that I have written. So this is an actual book published in the shops and you can pick it up from any good bookshop. You can also buy it on Amazon. It's on Kindle as well as an actual print book, and I absolutely encourage you to go and pick up a copy today. What I want to talk to you about in this video is probably the most interesting thing about the text in terms of what you're going to write about in the exam, something that is probably going to work its way into every exam answer, and that is narrative viewpoints. So one of the most unique aspects of Spies is Michael Frayn's blend of first and third person narrative viewpoints. We know that the novel begins in the first person with Stefan detailing how I catch it on the warm evening air as I walk. Now the pronoun I, of course, indicates a first-person narrator, and in a first-person narrative the story is told from the perspective of a character within it. In chapter 2, Stefan begins to think about Stephen, his childhood self, and references to Stephen are written in the third-person narrative voice, with our first-person narrator asking, for example, is that the way that he sees it at his age? So the use of the pronoun he here is at first confusing, but it refers to the narrator as a child, and all references to the narrator as a child are written in the third-person narrative voice. But when Frayn employs the third person, it's the third person limited narrator. Readers can only read the thoughts of Stephen himself. So in effect, this limited narrator leaves the reader in the same position as the first person narrator. We never know what Keith, Mrs. Hayward, or any of the other characters are thinking. And this leaves the reader in the position of a spy. Like Stephen and Keith, we see what happens and have to work out what it all means. So the rest of the novel flips between the present and the past using the first and third person narrative voice, and this chronology is a structural device employed by Frayn. The non-linear timeline is a key feature of postmodern literature, and I go into more detail on that in the guide. So young Stephen and old Stefan are the same person. So the key question really is, why does Frayn shift from first to third person narration when writing about the same person? And there are a number of reasons. Firstly, the shift in narrative voice performs a technical function, helping readers to distinguish between what young Stephen believes is happening and what is actually taking place in reality. There are numerous occasions where the young Stephen experiences something that he misunderstands, and perhaps the most comical example is found when Stephen and Keith are looking through Mrs. Hayward's diary. So they're looking at the diary, and on page 48, the boys discover, in the little gap between the date itself and the current phase of the moon, a tiny X. And upon a further inspection, the boys discover that a pattern begins to emerge. The X, whatever it is, happens once a month. Sometimes it's crossed out and entered a day or two earlier or later. The boys go on to assume that these markings refer to the times when Mrs. Hayward has, as they think, secret meetings. But to the reader, there's an obvious different meaning. Frayn hints at the true meaning of the X with the reference to the current phase of the moon and the fact that each X is entered once a month. So the references we can see are actually Mrs. Hayward making a note of when her menstrual period is due and when it actually arrives. And similarly, we guess that the very rare exclamation marks, including one next to the words wedding Aniv on page 49, mark the occasions when Mr. and Mrs. Hayward have had sexual intercourse. The boys are wrong in their assessment, but their error is due to their ages. They could not be expected to know about menstruation and sex at such young ages and in such an era. But crucially, old Stefan would know what these markings were. So retelling the story as an old man, he would be aware of his childhood error. And if we imagine a retelling of this moment from the first person narrator of old Stefan, it might be something like, When Mrs. Hayward was asleep, we looked through her diary. We found an X and guessed it was a secret meeting with a spy, but now, of course, I realise it was nothing of the sort. So throughout the entire novel, there's a sense of mystery and confusion, and much of this is only achieved by allowing the reader to be misled by the assumptions of Keith and Stephen. The third-person narrator, then, reminds us that we are reading what the boys themselves understood rather than the reality of what was actually happening. And there are numerous occasions where this takes place in the novel. When Stephen believes Keith has seen a kind of talking monkey on page 18, the reader knows this cannot be true. As a reader, we don't trust Keith, but young Stephen does. When Stephen notes that Mrs. Hayward posted letters several times a day on page 20, the reader knows it's very unlikely that she's actually posting letters each time she leaves the house. But young Stephen doesn't realise this. So in this way, the reader themselves becomes the spies. The readers become the spies of the title, looking at everything taking place and working out what the young, naive Stephen simply cannot work out. And as we'll see when we move on to a later video, and you'll see it in the book, this is a complete subversion of the generic conventions of the spy novel. But this is the really great thing that I love about this book. It's about what happens with the first-person narrator. You see, it would be very easy to assume that in the third-person narrative viewpoint indicates childish naivety, and the first-person narrative viewpoint indicates some kind of mature, objective voice. But this isn't the case. For sections of the novel that are written in the first-person narrative viewpoint, we are faced with the topic of the unreliable narrator. So whenever you study a text written in the first-person narrative voice, you have to ask, is the narrator reliable? Because the whole story is told from one character's perspective, there's no corroboration from other characters or an objective third-person narrator from whom we can clarify the reliability of what we read. And the term unreliable narrator refers to a narrator whose credibility is called into question. And this is certainly the case in Spies. Frayn masterfully undermines his first-person narrator at the very start of the novel. On page 6, Stefan jokes that he can be contacted at Amnesia Avenue, and this is an early indication that Stefan, now an old man, has trouble with his memory. So as a reader, we question whether we can trust everything we're being told by this narrator. There's no sense of malice in his lack of trustworthiness, it's simply that he's getting old and cannot remember things so well. To fully appreciate this, we need to consider the nature of the plot. Elderly Stefan revisits London, retells the story of his childhood months spent spying with his friend Keith. Note here that the whole story, first and third person, is told by Stefan, and everything we read comes from his recollection of events. So the question is, how can we trust his recollection of events when he himself admits that his recollection is not trustworthy? Such an interesting flipping between the first and the third person. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a thumbs up, and please do support the publication of the new Spies guide. Pick up a copy, and thank you for watching the video.